Hello, thank you so much for coming. So first let's talk about the big con before I dive into reading from the book, because you need to know a little bit about what happened to the main character, J. Frank Norfleet, before we get to the section that I'm going to read. So it's December 1919. J. Frank Norfleet is a Texan rancher. He's 54 years old, in the prime of his life. He has made a bunch of money for himself. He's fairly prosperous, and he has made that money by hewing to his principles, which include doing business with a handshake with other honest, upright people. You can see where this is going. He comes to Dallas for a land deal from the Texas Panhandle, where he's from. And very quickly, he is ensnared by a team of swindlers, 5 men, and they're headed by their ringleader, Joseph Fury. And they've done their research on him. They understand who Norfleet is and exactly how to take him. And over a series of almost 2 weeks, they very gradually ensnare him in what we now know as the big con, a particular structure of swindling that is a little bit too long to describe here, but if you've seen The Sting, then you know what I'm talking about. It's an entire play with sets and actors and costumes and extras, and it basically boiled down to Joseph Fury convincing Norfleet that he was placing money on a stock exchange using insider tips, so he couldn't possibly go wrong, and it was worth his while to put quite a bit of his own money behind this absolutely sure thing. And the stock market was, in fact, rigged. It was just rigged completely against him, and the whole thing was a set. So this all happens in the first chapter of my book, and that chapter ends with him realizing he has been taken for everything he's worth, plus a bunch more. The swindlers actually play the con on him twice because he was so invested in the story they were telling him that he went home and got more money and played the con again after he had been swindled. And so he was $45,000 poorer at the end of these 2 weeks, and he was absolutely stone broke. So the end of the con, the last act in the play, calls for the Mark to go home silent and never say what has happened to him, both because his reputation could not survive such a mortification, but also because the Mark thinks that he has been participating in something shady or underhanded, and that if he tries to prosecute his swindlers, he himself will be open to prosecution. So in this way, the swindlers buy the Mark's silence. But J. Frank Norfleet was no ordinary Mark, and he made the extraordinary decision to put his entire life on hold, turn his ranch over to his wife, and spend the next, what turned out to be 4 years, tracking down the 5 men that swindled him. And he had no credentials to do this, no qualifications whatsoever. He was not in any way a detective. He knew nothing about where to find these guys. But he was so outraged, and his principles had been so violated that it made sense for him to do that. So I'm going to read from the 4th chapter, which is kind of where his unique part of the story picks up, where the part where he deviates from the con man's script and he decides to make this decision, and what happens really begins. So chapter 4, Humbug. When Norfleet asked himself where in the whole blessed country to begin looking for 5 men skilled in the arts of subterfuge, the image of a little red notebook floated up before his mind's eye. He hadn't consciously noted it before, but now that he thought about it, he remembered it as Fury's address book. He turned it around in his head, put it back down on the imagined hotel bed where he first saw it, and then, on impulse, picked it back up and opened it. The mental trick worked. Inside, he saw a long list of names written in different hands, and one in particular stuck out to him, a Mr. S.N. Cathy from Corpus Christi. Norfleet knew Cathy well, had hired one of his relatives on the Spade Ranch 30 years earlier, and though the name hadn't stirred anything in him when he first encountered it, he suddenly realized its potential significance. Kathy was now a landowner like himself, and his name was surely in the little red book because he was on Fury's succor list. A flood had recently devastated Corpus Christi, and Norfleet could easily imagine Fury persuading Kathy to liquidate his already sodden real estate in pursuit of more durable coinage. Norfleet's first trip was to Corpus Christi to see if his old friend had encountered the Gang of Five, but he was told that Kathy was away in California on a prospecting trip. It was Eliza, his wife, who gave him his next lead. As they sat together one day, talking over the case while Norfleet cleaned his rifle, she mused that when Spencer, one of the 5 swindlers, had visited their ranch to survey it for the, as we now know, mythical Green Immigration Land Company, he had spoken learnedly and amusedly of his travels all around the country, everywhere except the state of California, all mention of which was conspicuously absent in Spencer's conversation. Could it be, she wondered, because that is where the gang hides out? You've hit it, that's it. That's the very reason they never yipped a word about the Golden State, Norfleet shouted, leaping up from his chair. And here I should say that any dialogue in this book is not invented. This is all quoted from something that Norfleet has written. So these are his authentic words. This is what he said. His mind instantly made all of the connections. It all comes to me now. See? They made a getaway from here the minute they got my money, he conjectured. Sure as shooting, they gathered up Kathy at Corpus Christi, and the whole outfit hit it straight for Sunny Cal. The story felt so right to him that he wasted no time. Eliza helped him pack, and within 2 hours, he was on his way to California. This very thinnest of leads shot him all the way across the plains and deserts to San Bernardino. Why San Bernardino? Well, simply because he had to get off the train somewhere, and he decided to work the state from the bottom up. Norfleet later offered no other explanation for charging forth, as if this one sufficed. It was dusk when he arrived, and the decorations strung around the town reminded him that it was Christmas Eve. The holiday had utterly fled his mind when he'd had his revelation. As he walked around the neighborhoods, imagining the families inside, and wondering what his own family was doing back at the ranch, he experienced the first, and really the only, moment of doubt in his quest. He longed to get right back on the train and return home before he exposed himself as a fool. But as he walked, the sights before his eyes began to meld with the thoughts constantly looping through his mind. He caught himself imagining Fury and Spencer squeezing down chimneys, scooping up the presents, and fleeing the way they had come. Norfleet laughed to discover that he had become inescapably obsessed, then turned in for the night. So on Christmas morning, lonely and sheepish, but still resolute, Norfleet went to the sheriff's office and met Walter Shea. Norfleet spilled his entire story to Sheriff Shea, sparing none of the details of his own gullibility and describing his enemies as precisely as he knew how. Shea let him get all the way to the end of his speech before replying, "The sheriff's office doesn't make a general practice of giving every stranger in town a Christmas present, but I may have one for you." It took a moment for the words to register with Norfleet. The sheriff beckoned him over to the cells and pointed. There, in adjoining cages, sat Ward and Gerber, the fraudulent secretaries of the Dallas and Fort Worth stock exchanges. Norfleet's stomach turned. His entire body broke out in a sweat, and he felt a tingle run up and down his spine. And yet, despite his revulsion, his first absurd impulse was to wish his enemies a Merry Christmas. After all, for most of the time that he'd known Ward and Gerber, they'd been his esteemed colleagues, crisp, well-dressed executives who had treated him with deference and respect. He marveled at how utterly their affects had changed and how little they resembled their former selves. Ward turned to him sullenly and sneered like a common thief. "So you found us, did you damned old fox?" Gerber, the one Norfleet had picked as the killer in the gang, was craven. "Norfleet, for God's sake, don't identify us," he shouted. "Have mercy on us, have pity on us. For God's sake, don't identify us." Keeping his face impassive, Norfleet turned and followed Sheriff Shea back to his office without a word. As soon as they were out of earshot, Norfleet grilled the sheriff for the details of their arrest. Shea told him an extraordinary, an astonishing, and nearly unbelievable story. A Texan by the name of Kathy, did Norfleet know him, was in San Bernardino for business and had fallen in with a group of phony stockbrokers. He was just about to close a deal with them when he read in the newspaper of Norfleet's swindle. Kathy knew at once that he was in the hands of the same men, minus Reno Hamlin as the mule buyer, and he dashed from the hotel room he was sharing with the swindlers and accosted the first police officer he saw on the street. Alas, Fury's crew spotted him talking to the officer and fled the hotel. Fury and Spencer disappeared via the fire escape, but Sheriff Shea managed to intercept Ward and Gerber a few minutes later at the train station. He took the chance of detaining them long enough to wire Sheriff Sterling Clark in Fort Worth, and he received